Hey everyone, in this video we're going to actually create the current weather app using ReasonML and React. So we're going to be using the weather API here, specifically the current weather data, and you're going to need an API key. So go ahead and sign in and get an API key. I'll be storing my API key in env.reason. So once you add your API key in there, let's go ahead and set up our API file. And we'll add the endpoint and add your API key like so. I'm also going to add a function to get the endpoint for the city query. And then a little later, we're also going to query by the geolocation. And lat and long is going to be a float. So you will have to cast it to a string using js.float.toString. And we could add a type here to get the specific endpoint. We're going to be using a variant with a parameter based on what endpoint we want. And with some basic pattern matching, we can call the endpoint functions appropriately. This one is geo. Now we're going to need to use fetch to make the HTTP request. So there's a reason library out there called bsfetch. It's a very thin wrapper around the fetch API. And it just makes working with it more reason-like instead of having to manipulate it with raw JavaScript. So we'll use that. And I'm going to take this opportunity to also add the BS.JSON library. It comes from Glenn SL. And we're going to need that for decoding JSON, the API response as if it was a natural reason data structure. Alright, once those two libraries are installed with npm, we're going to also have to add it to bsconfig in bs dependencies here so that the buckle script compiler will build those and we have access to it. Now sometimes for me, the buckle script compiler doesn't always add them, so we're going to do a yarn clean and then a quick yarn build to see if it builds. These are the important lines here. Just make sure that it says bsfetch and JSON, and then this is the Webpack stuff. We don't care about that at the moment, but it's good that it happened. Finally, that means we can add our fetch weather function. And it's going to take the endpoint, which is going to be called by getEndpoint, and fetch weather is going to return us a JavaScript promise, and inside the promise is where we could access the bsfetch library and fetch the endpoint. And always with fetch, we need to add a then here, so then we could do response.json to parse it as JSON data. And then for now, we'll log out that JSON. Let's also make sure that we resolve this promise and test it out. So let's go back into our app, and we'll be using the use effect so that we can call that getWeather function on mount. And I will provide the city of Las Vegas, because that's where I live. I actually have to do this. Oh, I have to provide the get endpoint of, there you go. And that's kind of annoying, so I'm going to open up API so we don't have to prefix everything. And also for the use effect, make sure that you add the return of none. And let's start our servers. Open up the console, and there's our weather API. Now this is JSON and it's JavaScript, but we can't actually access it right now, so we need to decode it. And that's why we added the BS.JSON. But we also don't need all of these attributes, so what I'm going to do instead is decode pieces of it that we actually want to use and display to the user. So let's add a new file called decode.reason, and this is where we're going to add all of our JSON decoding stuff. So we'll start with the type of the outer response, and I know I want the name because that's going to be the name of the location. And then using the decode library, we could add a function called decode response, which will return a json.decode, and it'll take in every attribute of that response. And we'll pipe the JSON into a function called field, which takes in the attribute of the raw JSON, and it takes in a decoder. This one is going to be string, so Pretty straightforward. Now there are nested objects in there. One of them is going to be main. And for that, we need a decoder for that nested object. So we'll add the type for main, which just has a float inside of it for the temperature. But now we also need to add a decode main, which follows the same thing as this. We'll have a JSON.decode, and we'll pipe that JSON to get the field of temperature with a type of float. And then decode response, we get provide main. Let's make sure we have a comma here. And the name is main. And we want to give it the decoder of decode main. And lastly, we'll also want a weather. Now weather's gonna be a little different. It is a nested object, and we want the description and the icon, which are both strings, but the JSON response has it inside of an array. So we'll have to decode it appropriately. First, let's add a decode weather here and provide the JSON.decode. Description will follow the same pattern, and same for icon. Now decode response is red because we have to add the weather attribute so that it could match the type of response up here. So following the same pattern, except now we know that it's inside an array, so we'll have to wrap the decoder inside an array as well, and it should decode properly now. Now we can go back into our API and use the decoder appropriately. So before we resolve, we're going to pipe it through the decode response, and I think I can do this. Alright, cool. We'll provide the module of decode so that we can add that function. But I also want to create another type to flatten out the response so that it's easier for us to use inside of our components. So I'll add a weather data, and now we want to add a function to coerce the decoded response into weather data. And this function is going to be named format weather data, which takes the decode.response. And then we can just access the nested properties of the decoder response. And reason, you can still use the bracket notation for array types. And that's how we're going to get description and icon. And then finally in fetch weather, after we decode the response, we'll pipe it into format weather data, and then we'll resolve it then. And that means now we can get rid of this console log and these brackets and that semicolon. And now in app, let's instead use a JS promise. And we can log out the resulting weather data. And then we'll need to resolve that. And we'll ignore it, so then the linting will go away. So now the resulting response looks like this. And this is exactly what we want to display. So let's add some React state here. And what we want to store inside of React state for now is going to be none. So now we could do set weather here and provide the data. And the data has to be of type option, so we're going to wrap it in a sum. And set weather actually has to be a function, so we'll do that. And just as a remark, the parameter here is the previous value, and then the return type is what is being set. And we can also one line this. So it's a little better looking. Let's also add a catch, just in case there's an error. So we can log it out, but I also want to set the weather to none before we resolve the promise. And now in our JSX, we can do a pattern match on weather. And if weather doesn't exist, we'll just say loading. If however there is some data inside of weather, we'll add a component, but for now, let's just display, let's go with data.description. And let's check that out in our browser again. So on a refresh, we saw the loading, and then it also changed to clear sky because the data came back. So the last thing that we're going to need to do is create that weather and it'll take the prompt of data, which is of type API.weatherdata. Let's also get the image source using require image, where we're going to concatenate the path and the file extension. So then here we just do source is going to be data.icon and piped into image source. Let's also give it an alt of data.description and then just a paragraph tag for each of the other properties. Temp is a float, so we need to cast it into a js.float.toString. Now we can use this as an app. So instead of the h1, we'll do weather, and we'll provide data. And if we save and go to our browser, there's our thing. It's pretty ugly, but we're getting there. Now in our app, I want to simplify this promise here a little bit so that we don't have to call get endpoint inside of fetch weather. So inside of API, I'm just going to make a little helper function called get weather, which takes in a query that we can feed into get endpoint, and then with the endpoint, we can feed it into fetch weather. And then in app, we can replace this entire line with get weather. This way it'll be easier for us to work on the geolocation feature, which I'm going to store in another file called geo.reason. And here we want to interact with raw JavaScript. So to do that, we need the BS raw syntax. And specifically, we want to see if we have access to the window navigator.geolocation. Now let's give this a type signature. It's going to be an option of something. So we'll give it a generic of A. And the function that we want is going to be given to us by the window or the DOM API. It's going to be called getCurrentPosition. So we're going to map it to the raw JavaScript of navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition. Let's also give this the appropriate type signature. It returns a unit, which means that there's no return type. But it'll take two arguments of onSuccess and onError, and both of those are of type function that returns a unit. So now let's define a function that we can use in our application. And I'll just call it getGeolocation. And the arguments here that I want is going to be sendGeolocation and sendError. And I know that we're going to pattern match to see if the geolocation API is actually available to us. If it is, we'll call getCurrentPosition through the raw JavaScript. And if it isn't available, then we'll just log out that it's not available. Now getCurrentPosition needs an onSuccess and onError. So we're going to define that up here. So onSuccess, we're going to call sendGeo and give it the raw value of latitude and longitude. And then onError, we'll just send the error of E. That is because I need to add a C here and a C here. So now in our app, in our use effect, we can send in either a city or the current geolocation. So with the geolocation, we could call the geo module and then call getGeolocation, which takes in sendGeo and sendError. And we also need to define what those things do. SendGeo will take in the latitude and longitude, and that's where we could call getWeather of geo, lat_long, and then sendError, we could just log out the error. So now sendGeo is red because getWeather has a return type. So to fix that, we're going to remove this JS promise here to its own function called onWeather, and then we'll move getWeather of city to that own function and give this city, replace this with a W, and pipe sendGeo to onWeather. So now in our browser, our app should get the current weather based on the geolocation, or not, because I misspelled it. Get current position. So now we can allow the geolocation, and this should. So it turns out the geolocation isn't available in Chromium. So we're going to switch to Brave. And here's the app. So on a refresh, there it is. I don't know why it says Winchester, because I don't live there. we're gonna make one last component. So we're gonna make use of this onCity function. And that component is gonna be called a city form. It needs to be in source. I do this all the time. And we're gonna place it where this hello world used to be. So the city form is gonna want to take in the function of onCity. We're gonna return a form that has an input of type text and a button of type submit with the text of submit. Alright, let's make this a little more interactive by getting some state. So we're going to use state of an empty string, set that value into the inputs, and then on change, we'll get the event.target.value and use that to call set value. Now something I think I haven't mentioned is we have this pipe and this pipe. The difference is the skinny arrow pipe means that we're going to pass it in as the first argument to the next function. Specifically, we want the E to be right here instead of over here. And then the default pipe that I've been using is putting the argument as the last, or putting the value as the last argument to the next function. And most of these functions only have one argument, so it doesn't matter which pipe you use. I like this one, so yeah. Let's also give a placeholder of intercity. No ellipses. Now to make this form useful, I'm going to have an onSubmit function so that we can prevent default and send the variant city with the value to onCity so it can be called an app. And in the app component, we just add the city form here and pass it onCity. I have to edit this. There we go. And let's make sure that we add onCity underneath onWeather since it's dependent on it. But now, in our application, we have this little thing where we can add in a city and submit, and we'll get the current weather. Let's try a different city like London. Right, the last thing we need to do is style this application so it's easier on the eyes. Alright, so let's first give it a font family of sans serif. Let's add a container where the width 60%, margin and margin top. And let's also text align everything to the center. Set a city form class name. And I'm gonna use a descendant selector of inputs, display block, 1 pixel, solid. We'll need to give the class name to the city form. Width is going to be 100%. Font size, how big is that? And let's give it some padding. So I'm going to go with 0.2 rem. Yeah, that's fine. Let's also do some stuff to the button. So I want this to also be 100%. I just want top and bottom padding. So let's go with font size of 1 rem, text transform, uppercase. Now let's get rid of that gross background color. I want a better color. Let's go with this color. Border, none, and then border radius of 4 pixels. Let's give it white. I want to change the padding now to something bigger, so let's go with 5. That is fair. Let's change this black to match. All right. I kind of want this to be a card-looking thing. So what is that? That's the weather. So let's add a class name here. Weather card. Let's give it some rounded corners and 1 pixel, solid. Let's reuse that same color. Margin top, 1 rem. Want some padding on the bottom. Let's also make it bigger font size. I'm okay with that actually. I also realized that the temperatures that's shown is in kelvins, which is the correct temperature because that's my name. But I think it would be a good idea to actually change that so that it displays Fahrenheit and Celsius for the rest of the world. So in utilities, let's add two functions to convert kelvins to Celsius and Fahrenheit. And to Celsius, that means that we're going to subtract 273.15. And to Fahrenheit, we're going to first convert the kelvins to Celsius, and then multiply it by the fraction of 9/5, and then add 32. For all of these operators, we need to add the decimals to make sure that we're using float values instead of ints. And then weather, I think we can just add another use state here. Let's also add a variant. So then the state's initial value will be Celsius. So then we could pattern match on that temperature and convert the temperature accordingly. And then we could convert that float into a string, and then finally that string into a React compatible string. And I want to make use of this set temp, so we'll just make an onClick function that toggles Celsius and Fahrenheit, and add that here to this paragraph. So if we click out on it, and there we go. So we have a complete weather application. Alright, so that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, consider subscribing or liking the video, and I'll see you next time.